From Care of the Soul by Thomas Moore. Mainstream psychology puts a great deal of faith in a strong ego. Ego development and positive self-concept are considered important ingredients of a mature personality. Yet, narcissism, the habit of focusing attention on oneself rather than the world of objects and of others, is considered a disorder. I'm often surprised in my therapeutic work when an otherwise mature and discerning adult is faced with some tough choices, collapses everything into the statement, "I can't be selfish." When I explore this weighty moral imperative with the person further, I usually find that it is tied to a religious upbringing. "I was taught never to be selfish," she will say with finality. I notice, however, that while this person insists on her selflessness, she seems in fact to be quite preoccupied with herself. In pursuit of the virtue of selflessness, attention to self can go underground and become an unconscious and corrosive attachment to pet theories and values. Our common intolerance for narcissism is in another is an indication that there is sand in that particular oyster. Our reaction is a signal that this area may hold something of importance. In this sense, narcissism is a shadow quality. Jung explains that when we meet something of the shadow in the other, we often feel repulsed, but that is because we are confronting something in ourselves that we find objectionable, something with which we ourselves struggle, something that contains qualities valuable to the soul. The negative image we have of narcissism may indicate that self-preoccupation contains something we need so badly that it is surrounded by negative connotations.
The negative image we have of narcissism may indicate that self-preoccupation contains something we need so badly that it is surrounded by negative connotations. It is an observation by psychologist Thomas Moore that bears repeating. And so I'm going to say it again. The negative image we have of narcissism may indicate that self-preoccupation contains something we need so badly that it is surrounded by negative connotations. We banish the immature, self-absorbed image of ourself to the underworld of our psyches and fail to notice the lovely flower we have become. What we need so badly from self-preoccupation is compassion for the self. What we need is to embrace our shadow and to retrieve our soul. When I use the word soul, I do not give it the traditional religious definition. I do not mean the spiritual part of humans that survives death. When Thomas Moore uses the word in his series of books that include Care of the Soul, Dark Nights of the Soul, and Soulmates, and there are a couple more, he defines it as depth, value, relatedness, heart, and personal substance. A person's soul is their profound essence. When I use the word soul, I am reminded of the concept of duende. A Spaniard will say, "Tiene duende," about a flamenco performance or a work of art. And they mean that the expression moved them with authenticity and depth. There is an earthiness implied in the word duende, an acknowledgement of soul. When we acknowledge our own soul, we will bump into our own shadow. When we embrace our shadow, we learn to love the whole of who we are. Now I become myself. It's taken time, many years and places, are the first words of May Sarton's poem that celebrates the eternal process of self-discovery. Sarton, a prolific writer of novels, poetry, memoirs, and journals, is a favorite among Unitarian Universalists. Although she never became a member of any of our churches, she regularly presented her poetry at UU congregations and delivered the 1982 Ware Lecture at our annual General Assembly. In her memoir, At 70, written in 1984, she recalled a sermon she heard at the age of 10, given by a Unitarian minister. She wrote, "It made a great impression on me and really marked me for life. I can hear him saying, 'Go into the inner chamber of your soul and shut the door.' The slight pause after soul did it. A revelation to the child who heard it and who has never forgotten it." Sarton went into the inner chamber of her soul and discovered the need to slow down and feel the weight of who she was in each given moment. In the poem, it is the poet's own hand that casts a shadow on the page. There is no difference between the shadow of her hand and the shadow of the word that comes from her own hand. The thought and the shaper of the thought are one. My work, my love, my time, my face, gathered into one intense gesture of growing like a plant. Rooted in love, the eye that once ran from itself stops all time with the simple realization, now I become myself. Willing to see the shadow cast each time we wear other people's faces instead of our own, and willing to notice the shadow cast when we run wildly from the flowering of our own soul, the poet gathers all of who she is into this one intense gesture of growing like a plant. First, she must notice the shadow cast by her own hand. The Jungian concept of the shadow reminds us that there are darker parts of the human heart that cannot be ignored. The darker parts are those pieces of ourselves that we discard along the way. The career we chose not to follow. The job we didn't get. The marriage that fell apart. The child that didn't live up to expectations. We automatically banish parts of ourselves to the underworld of our psyches in order to avoid pain. We are told not to be so selfish, and our need to love ourselves goes underground. It gets banished like Narcissus to the underworld. If we get stuck in a theological interpretation of this myth or in an overly moralistic interpretation, we stay with the Narcissus of the underworld and fail to notice the flowering of the true self. The flowering of the true self that is the result of falling in love with an image of ourselves that emerges from the depths of our own being. Our common intolerance for narcissism in another is an indication that there is sand in that particular oyster. Our reaction is a signal that this area may hold something of importance. In this sense, Narcissism is a shadow quality, Thomas More tells us. More analyzes the myth of Narcissus as told by the Roman writer Ovid. The details Ovid includes in his version shed light in the shadow of narcissism in a way that moralistic versions of the tale do not. This is not just a story about the goddess Nemesis punishing a shallow young man who cannot give love back to those who love him. This is a story contained in Ovid's long work, Metamorphoses, and so it's a story about transformation. As a young man, Narcissus is so attractive that he is surrounded by friends who lavish him with attention. But he is filled with pride and has no need to be loved. Here is self-love as self-absorption. On the surface, it looks like Narcissus doesn't need anyone else because he is so full of himself. In reality, he doesn't even know himself. This is before he is punished with the curse of self-reflection. And so, one of the young people who lavished Narcissus with attention and got nothing back for it curses him by saying, "May he fall in love and not have what he loves." The goddess Nemesis, the goddess of retribution and punishment, says, "May he who will not love others love only himself." This is our common intolerance for narcissism in another that curses what we cannot see even in ourselves. This reaction to Narcissus in the myth is a signal that something important is about to happen. Change is in the air. And so one day, after Narcissus has been in the forest tracking game for many hours, he comes upon a clear, deep pool that is very smooth and very still. And Ovid tells us that no one else has ever been to this pond. It has not been touched by humans or animals alike. It is partly in shade and shadow. And as Narcissus leans in to take a drink of this water, he falls in love for the very first time. Now, the images in Ovid's story are very important, not just the one image reflected back to Narcissus. Most importantly, there is the pond itself. No mere mirror, no thin glass. This is a pond in shadow. This is a deep well. And like Narcissus, we have wandered alone in the forest, thirsty for self-acceptance. And we don't arrive at self-acceptance by forcing it upon ourselves. You are going to love yourself. You really, really are. We don't get it by forcing it. We don't get it by surrounding ourselves with friends who love the surface self of who we are, the shallow self. We come upon self-acceptance unexpectedly, after much rejection, much confusion, much cursing. Self-reflection is a curse because it is so painful. The myth of Narcissus can be the cure for narcissism if we find ourselves ready for self-reflection in the watery depths. We can be cured of narcissism if we are willing to feel the pain of all the rejected parts of ourselves. Those parts that we have condemned to the silence of the underworld of our psyches. if we find ourselves ready to catch a glimpse of an image of our own self that we have never seen before, we can embrace the shadow side of narcissism. Now I become myself, the poet cries. It's me, cries Narcissus, when he finally realizes that the face in the water is his own. Finally able to love, he falls in love with something completely other than himself before he realizes that the face in the water he is seeing is his own. Blocked from loving who he thought he was, the very act of falling in love reveals a new, deeper image of the self. Developing compassion for oneself, we discover that the self has been redefined. Now to stand still, to be here, feel my own weight and destiny, the poet says. What I long for, I have, Narcissus says. And then he dies. Thomas More writes that theological commentaries on this tale used it as moral evidence against self-love. But in fact, the story shows that love is the transforming factor. Warming love creates soul. Narcissus discovers he is lovable and then dies to the self he once thought he was. The gods carry Narcissus' body off to the underworld, where for eternity he gazes at the image in the waters of the river Styx. Now, here is the real cautionary message of this tale. The images we carry in our psyches can continue to transform us, or they can remain in shadow and block the growth of our soul. The myth of Narcissus teaches us that the self we thought we were can melt away, revealing something new. The self we thought we were can dissolve into an image of the divine, which always waits as a seed ready to burst into an expression of our true self. Narcissus' friends look for his body but cannot find it. It has been replaced with the beautiful, sweet-scented, soft, supple flower. The rigid, unfeeling self has been replaced by the soft, loving sense of self. Rooted in love, now I become myself. Narcissism as a shadow quality is healed when we embrace it fully, and transformation occurs. This myth is not a moral tale about selfishness deserving of punishment. It is a myth that teaches us that before we can have compassion for others, we must first develop compassion for ourselves. The shadow that narcissism casts is cold and empty. The true narcissist doesn't actually love himself. Immature self-absorption reveals itself through puffed up, boastful pride, and often masks a low self-esteem. We all know someone who constantly talks about their own self in an effort to hide the pain that lurks behind the shadows. False superiority often hides self-hatred. And we get caught in a thinking trap that the opposite of narcissistic self-love is constant self-criticism. We beat ourselves up. We convince ourselves that we are unlovable. The shadow quality of narcissism keeps us separate from all forms of love. It is important to recognize that we all have a dark side. It is important to gather our denied aspects back to the whole of who we are. When we receive messages from these denied or repressed aspects, it is a signal that our soul needs repairing. These messages usually come in the form of harsh judgment of others. In our refusal to remove the beam from our own eye, choosing only to see the mote in other people's eyes, we receive a signal from soul that there is something lurking in the shadows that needs our attention. Psychotherapy, shamanic healing, dream work, and spiritual practices can all help us gather our denied aspects back into the whole of who we are. Any form of meditation can help us gather our splintered self back to the home of the soul. It doesn't have to be the sitting on the cushion for 20 minutes a day kind of meditation. It doesn't need to be the yogic breath techniques kind of meditation. It might be a 3-minute meditation done weekly during the worship service. Any kind of awareness that takes you to the isolated deep pool of yourself to receive a new self-image can be called meditation. Journaling, like May Sarton, writing from the depth of your being. These can be most powerful forms of meditation. When insight is allowed to arise from the black shadow of our own hand that casts that shadow along with the word on the paper. The Jungian concept of the shadow reminds us that there are darker parts of the human heart that cannot be ignored. The darker parts are those pieces of ourselves that we discard along the way. They are often the parts of ourselves that we more readily recognize in others, attacking them for what we most despise in ourselves. And we not only do this on an individual basis, but on a global basis as well, as institutions, as nations. A former U.S. president claimed there was an axis of evil that harbored weapons of mass destruction, and then he used his claim to promote a war. Our own country's sense of self is overshadowed by a strong narcissism. America can be led to the transforming waters of self-reflection and die to a hardened self-absorption. Our own country can learn to love a new image of itself once it embraces its own shadow. Our own nation can be transformed. Now I become myself, the poet cries. It's me, cries Narcissus, when he finally realizes that the face in the water is his own. Now to stand still, to be here, feel my own weight and destiny, the poet says. What I long for I have, Narcissus says. Developing compassion for yourself means that you learn to love the whole of who you are. Embrace your shadow and become whole. May it be so, and amen. And so we enter November with the third step in the 12 steps to living a compassionate life. And I think happily in November that third step is compassion for yourself. I also love that December's step, the fourth step, is empathy. I think maybe there is no accident that we started in September and the third and fourth step fall in these months when we definitely need compassion for ourselves and hopefully can move into some empathy. So I invite you into this spiritual practice of deepening compassion for yourself and empathy for others. And now, please join me as we read the words printed in your order of service to extinguish the chalice. Please remain standing for the benediction, and I invite you to join hands. Embrace your shadow and become whole. Allow yourself to be changed by each step towards living more compassionately. Be surprised by what can be called holy, a life lived more deeply, an action taken from wholeness, a community living its faith in the world. Go in peace, blessed be, and amen.
The Caneo Valley Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. Our mission is to nurture spiritually courageous people who transform the world through justice and compassion. Like us on Facebook, check out our website at CVUUF.org, or come visit us. See you soon!